First Kings, there's going to be a lot of kings that we're going to look at, both in the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But we're looking at the last king of the United Kingdom, and that is Solomon. Solomon ruled 40 years. David ruled 40 years. And Saul ruled 40 years. So the United Kingdom had a total of 120 years of stability and unity. Solomon's kingdom was the wealthiest, and it was spread out over more territory than any other. Solomon was responsible for 3 books of the Bible: Song of Solomon, and also the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes. We read here in the scriptures that he wrote 1,005 songs. And also, he had 3,000 proverbs that he had written. We do not have any record of any more than 600 of his proverbs in the book of Proverbs, which he wrote. So the other ones have been lost, but they're mentioned here in the Bible. Solomon, when he started out, was very devoted to God. When he ended up, he wasn't. But when he began his rule in place of his father, he was very humble, much like Saul was, and he asked the Lord to give him wisdom. Didn't ask for anything else, just wisdom. And God granted him not only wisdom, because he asked that request, but also wealth and power over all of his enemies. I want us to notice something in chapter 3. We'll be starting with chapter 3, but we'll be jumping back for a short time to chapter 2. In chapter 3, verse 3, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. Now, the reason that the Jewish people did that is because they didn't have a temple yet. They didn't have a central place to worship. So they weren't really doing like the heathen were. They were building altars to God and offering the sacrifices that Moses told them to give. But it showed here that Solomon walked according to the instructions given him by his father. Now let's briefly notice again in review. In chapter 2, in verse 1, David is going to die, and he's going to share these words with his son Solomon. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. I want you to notice here in the next verse, twice the word if is used. All of these blessings are conditional. And it says, the Lord may keep his promise to me if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul. You will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. Now let's go back to chapter 3 and see, starting in verse number 5, how Solomon, in a dream, prays to God for wisdom. At Gibeah, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Drop down to verse 7. "Now, Lord my God," this is Solomon speaking, "you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" In verse 10, we see the Lord's response. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you've asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings." As we go into the latter part of chapter 3, I'd like to read in its entirety the story that proves how wise Solomon was. A story that we've heard many times, but I'd like to read it in its entirety. It's just from verse 16 down to the end of the chapter. So look at verse 16, and we're going to read the story, which shows us an example of Solomon's wisdom. "Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him." Now this is very interesting in itself, as one commentator pointed out. It wasn't normal for women of prostitution to stand before a king. But it was pointed out that Solomon was very people-oriented. And we're going to see something else about what he did for the people that showed that he cared for them politically and personally. So these 2 prostitutes got to go before the king. 17, "Now, one of them said, 'Pardon me, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, 'No, the living one is my son. The dead one is yours.' But the first one insisted, 'No, the dead one is yours. The living one is mine.' And so they argued before the king. The king said, 'This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive.' Then the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, 'Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." So the real mother said, "Don't kill him." But the others said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Then the king gave this ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe, because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. In chapter 4, at the beginning of the chapter, we're not going to spend time on that because I want to get to chapter 20. But in chapter 4, there is a list of all of the people that were in Solomon's in his reign, as far as his appointments, all of his appointments of people that would be the generals and the people that would be the priests and on down the line that would have authority over the others. And so we're not going to take time for that, but I do want to get down to verse number 20 and notice some things about Solomon's wealth. And of course, later on we find out that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He had many palaces, and it took a lot of money to take care of putting all those women with all their children, to feed them, and then all of the people that ate at the king's table. That's, a lot of these people that were in the first part of this chapter would be eating at the king's tables as well. And we're going to see here some interesting things about how much it took just to support the meals. But in verse 20, I think every person who's ever been the head of any country in the world wishes this. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. Wouldn't every politician in the world wish that all of the people in his kingdom could eat and drink and be happy? I think of our own country. I don't care who you are as president, half the people are going to be unhappy. Because most of the times our presidents are chosen. That was a landslide this time, but usually there's just a little bit of a margin over 50% that they win an election. And I get tickled at the president sometimes. They get up and they talk about how the American people chose their way and their policies. And then I don't care if it's Republican or Democrat, I think to myself, yeah, but you got 49% that don't like you. You know what? Yeah, it's nice to have that 1% majority, and then sometimes there's these landslides, and you have more, but you still have a lot of people. Even just like we could see on the news now, there's just a lot of people that are opposed to the present administration. But here Solomon could say that his people were happy. And that's saying a lot. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. For full 40 years, he didn't have to worry about his enemies. They brought him taxes. Now, notice in 22 something very interesting. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal. 30 cores is 5.5 tons. And that's what it says here in the bottom here of the NIV. 60 cores of meal is 11 tons. Now this is daily. Also in his daily needs for his food, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 head of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. Gazelles were small antelopes. Roes, of course, were deer, but this particular kind of deer was a small European deer, so that was a male European deer. So that's what it took to feed the family, and also all the dignitaries. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates, and during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety. They had law and order. That's what we're struggling with today in our country. A lot of people want law and order. Some don't. And so there's a lot of struggle there. So they lived in safety. And here's another little interesting thing that I looked at in different commentaries, and even in the Living Bible. And Bruce and I discussed this last night because I was thinking of an incident from history that it reminded me of. But it says, during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. And I thought to myself, well, what is that referring to? One of the commentators says that Solomon protected the right for everybody to enjoy their own property. He did not invade their personal property. And it goes on to say in the Living Bible, each family had its own home and garden. Now, you could see why they were happy people. And I remembered this statement, and I asked Bruce to look. I thought he would probably know. He's kind of a historical dictionary anyhow. And I said, Bruce, I think you know the answer to this. I said, which of our presidents, because I learned it in high school, said a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage? I said, was it Roosevelt or was it Hoover? I thought to myself, no, it couldn't be Hoover, because a year after he got into, to be the president, it was the worst of the depressions in the history of the United States. But it was Hoover. In 1928, he's going around telling everybody a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And by the end of 1929, people were jumping out of the windows, killing themselves in New York City in 1929. So, here this Solomon could make the boast, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree, meaning each family had his own home and garden. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Go down to verse 29, and we see more about Solomon's wisdom and how extensive it was. Now, most of us remember that the Queen of Sheba, and this is a little later on, came to visit him and brought him a lot of gifts. But here it even tells very early on that a lot of the dignitaries of the countries around him sent emissaries just to listen to Solomon for advice. In verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the east, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else. Drop down to 30, the latter part of 31. His fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs. As I said, all but 600 of them have been lost. And his songs that he wrote numbered 1,005. We don't have those either. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. he spoke about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So in chapter 5, which we will get to next time, Solomon begins the building of his temple, the Lord's temple. His dad wanted to do it. David wanted to do it really bad. And in fact, Nathan, one of the prophets, says, "Oh, go ahead and do it." He thought it had God's blessing, but it turned out that God came to Nathan and said, "No, I don't want him to do it. David's a warrior. It'll be his son Solomon who will build it because there'll be a time of peace." And I think it's kind of interesting. He wanted the temple built during a time of peace. And it would take 7 years to do. Just wanted to tell you a couple things that's very interesting about how many people it took. If you look at chapter 5 and drop down to verse 13. Now what he did, he got a lot of his materials from a man by the name of Hiram of Lebanon. And he was a good friend of David's. And he and his men would send all this wood down to them. But Solomon had 30,000 of his own people, besides all the men that Hiram had working. Beyond that, he had what was called forced labor, because that would be the people that he conquered. And Solomon had, now listen to this, in verse 15, 70,000 carriers who carried all of the stone that went in the building, and 80,000 stone cutters in the hills. 80,000 men cutting the stone out of the hills. And then he had all of these others, 80,000, and there was a total of 150,000 of them just taking care of all of the stone cutting that went into it. And of course it took 7 years. So you can imagine how extravagant this building would be. We just can't picture it. We could see artists' conceptions of it in our Bibles, but we just can't picture the beauty of it. So we'll get into some details of it, and we'll not spend a lot of time and get wore down with it, but we'll touch into some of the things that are interesting, like I told you just now. So we'll stop for tonight. Does anybody want to add anything about what was said tonight?